This is the Reluctantly Independent podcast, and this is my chat with Vancouver-based cannabis activist and businessman DANA LARSEN. Alright, so I wanted to mostly talk about your thoughts regarding the upcoming legalization of cannabis in Canada, but before we do that, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how the Cannabis Day celebration in Vancouver went this year.
Cannabis Day was good. We moved it to Thornton Park a couple of years ago from the art gallery, and it's been a great spot for it. There's lots of room, and it's right near the SkyTrain, so it's very accessible, and we had a good turnout, and it was a great event. I actually, in a way, I like Cannabis Day more than I like 420, because Cannabis Day is very easy and simple, and 420 is very complicated, and there's a lot of media and a lot of hassle, and it's a much more difficult event to put on. But yeah, Cannabis Day this year was great.
Good. Were you guys able to get a permit this year? Because I know in the past that was a bit of an issue, right?
We never applied for a permit for Cannabis Day. In fact, we're not able. The park board 2 years ago, we applied for a permit for 420. And instead of even discussing that, they passed a resolution to never give any cannabis event a permit ever. So we weren't able to apply for 420 or for Cannabis Day or anything else because they refused to give any permits for any cannabis events. That might change with the new board. We'll see, because there's going to be an election in October, and we'll get a new park board. But the current park board, and it was only by a 1-vote margin, so it was very close. But the NPA, which is the right-wing party, they were joined by one of the Green Party people on the park board to team up and refuse any cannabis event a permit. So that, to me, is very unfair. I'm all for bylaws saying you can't smoke in the park on a regular basis, but to me, cannabis events should be treated like alcohol events and be able to get a permit and to use a public space like anybody else. And it's very discriminatory that they won't give us a permit, but that'll change eventually. Right.
And do you think, like, after legalization takes place, that it might be a little easier to deal with the city, or will there be, a new set of rules and regulations that might cause a new set of problems for you?
It's hard to say. There's a city and the park board, and they're governed by different parties and different attitudes, right? But with that being said, the city hasn't really been super friendly to cannabis events either. And the BC NDP government passed some very ridiculous cannabis laws, which include a ban on using cannabis in any parks or public spaces like that. So it makes it more challenging for a city to give us a permit, because it's now against municipal bylaws it's against provincial laws to use cannabis in parks now. So it's which didn't used to be the case, right? Because cannabis was just illegal, so there wasn't any rule about using it in a park. But now there is, and which is one of the many stupid laws that BC NDP has passed, which is very frustrating for me, because they've made it more difficult for cities to license cannabis events, not easier, which is backwards in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a shame for sure. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about your Overgrow Canada movement and how you feel about the progress of it so far, and whether or not you're going to continue to do it routinely?
Sure. Well, it's been 3 years now. In 2016, I started this campaign. I got my hands on a very large quantity of cannabis seeds, a low THC, high CBD variety. And so I announced I was going to give away 1 million seeds in 2016. And I went on a national tour to about 18 cities across the country. But on the second stop of my tour in Calgary, the police showed up and arrested one of our volunteers, and then they arrested me. And I spent the night in jail for trafficking in cannabis seeds, which is bizarre, because in Calgary, like most cities in Canada, there's at least a dozen places openly selling cannabis seeds over the counter in the city, high potency marijuana seeds and whatnot. So it's a bit bizarre to see them charging me for seeds when you can buy them openly everywhere. And of course, I continued my tour and went to many more cities across the country, and no police showed up anywhere else. But And because I got arrested, it made a lot of media attention, made a big deal, and I was actually able to give away 2 million seeds because there was so much people hearing about it, and it got so much coverage that the demand for seeds skyrocketed. And then the next year, I went back on tour again and went all across the country. My lawyer said, "Well, don't go back to Calgary because they've got it out for you." And I said, "Well, okay." But then I thought, no, I got to go back to Calgary. I can't not go. So I made that the last stop on my tour in 2017. And a couple of police officers showed up, but they didn't arrest anybody. And people at the event were like, if they try to arrest Dana, we're going to make a circle around him and we're going to link arms and make them arrest everybody. And so the police were like, okay, forget it. We're not going to bother with this. And so I feel like we won that battle. And when I went to court at the end of 2017, the judge just threw it all out and said it was dumb and had taken far too long to get to trial, and it was ridiculous anyways. And so that was it. And this year, I was able to give away, I didn't go on a tour this year, but I was able to give away millions more seeds. I think I've given away about 9 million seeds now all across Canada. And it's been a successful campaign, and that lots of people, I wanted people to plant them in public areas to normalize the cultivation of cannabis growing in public spaces, and to point out that cannabis is not a harmful plant, that at any children's playground, there's more plants growing there that are dangerous and toxic and can kill you if you eat them compared to cannabis. And people did definitely do a lot of that. I think I'm going to still continue. It's a question as to whether or not my seed supply will continue to hold out and be available next year. But I would keep on giving away seeds and encouraging people to plant them openly. To me, if cannabis is growing in public spaces, that should not be a big deal. If you walk down the street and you see some cannabis growing in a traffic circle or something, that should just be a nice thing. It shouldn't be something that makes you freak out or that's a big deal or whatever. And I feel our campaign has helped normalize some of that over the last 3 years.
And now that things are going to be legal, do you think that by giving away these seeds that you're going to face potential arrest from here on out if you do it again, if you decide to go on tour again?
Well, what I will be doing is still illegal. Mm-hmm. But, I don't know if anybody's going to bother arresting me again after 3 years or 2 years of touring the whole country and traveling to over 20 cities to openly give away seeds. The only time the police arrested, anybody showed up to arrest me was in Calgary on the 1 year. I don't think because the charges were dismissed and nobody really, the courts didn't really care. I don't think that anybody's going to try to arrest me again. But you never know. I was surprised that the police showed up in the first place and actually did the arrest. So I've been surprised before. But it seems to me that I don't think it's going to be a high priority giving away seeds like that.
Right. So in terms of legalization in BC, I noticed that the province has decided that the liquor distribution branch is going to be the wholesale distributor of non-medical cannabis in BC, and that it's going to run provincial cannabis retail stores. And I'm wondering what this means exactly. Like, does this effectively criminalize any private cannabis retailer or seller?
Well, we're all criminalized already, but BC actually is going to be allowing private retail as well. But you've still got to buy it from the liquor branch and from the BC government. So the licensed producer will grow the cannabis. They will sell it to the province, which will collect it, warehouse it, and then redistribute it again to the various stores, which to me is a very inefficient method because there's going to be costs involved in buying it, reselling it, warehousing it, which aren't really needed. I don't know why the licensed producer can't just sell directly to the store and why the province has to be an intermediary. That to me is only going to push the price up as more people's hands, as the product passes through more people's hands, everybody's got to get paid, right? So it's going to make it more expensive than it needs to be. And as someone who already sells cannabis through a dispensary, I have very mixed feelings about trying to become a participant in the legal system. Right now my dispensary sells a wide array of cannabis products, many strains, many edibles and capsules and suppositories and creams and all kinds of products. And if I was to try to become legit, I would need to shut down my shop entirely, put in an application to hopefully get a permit, which the odds are very much against. And if I were to receive a permit, I could open up again, but only sell dried buds, no extracts, no edibles, no capsules, no suppositories, none of the products that really have a stronger medicinal value, and only sell raw dried buds that come in pre-sealed packages, which I can't open or know what I'm selling or even smell it or be aware of what I'm making available. That's not really a very enticing business model or one that I really want to participate in. And I know a lot of dispensary operators do want to become legitimized, and I mean, I would too. All things being equal, I'd rather be legal and have a permit than not. But because the range of products and the system is so restrictive, I think that after legalization day, there's going to be a handful or a smattering of cannabis shops around the country. But there'll still be hundreds of dispensaries with much better products at lower prices and wider selection. And that's not really a model for legalization to work the way they think they want it to work. But they've got to create a more comprehensive, a more competitive, and wide-ranging form of legalization to really compete with the open market that's already out there now.
Right. And do you know how many permits the government is planning on giving out? Like, I understand they're not going to make it easy.
Well, in British Columbia, they haven't announced any kind of a cap on permits or anything like that. So it's really just going to depend. They're downloading a lot of it to municipalities. And so cities and towns are going to be the ones to decide. And some cities are already saying we don't want any dispensaries or anything like that here. And they're going to be limiting sales entirely. Other places are still way behind. So, like in Vancouver, for instance, they are way behind on their like licensing of dispensaries or getting permits in place. They don't have a system in place to do that. There's no mechanism there's no mechanism to allow for a legal shop to open in Vancouver, for instance. The bylaws and the rules they passed are all really about dispensaries, and they limit the number of dispensaries available in the city, and all those spots are already filled. So they're not going to be able to open up any kind of legal shops because the rules that they put in place are already all covered by the dispensaries that already exist. And I think the result of that is going to be that there's not going to be very many legal shops for at least 6 months or longer until they get all their organizing together and write new bylaws. In Ontario, it's the same thing, right? Ontario's said they're not going to have any legal shops until the spring now, and that they're just going to have mail order only to start with. And I expect most provinces or most people in most provinces on October 18th, their only source of legal marijuana is going to be through mail order, and that's not going to be very competitive.
Right, right. And it sounds like there's quite the restriction on growing as well. Like, from my understanding, we're going to be allowed 4 legal plants, and even if you're growing them outdoors, we have to keep them from the view of the public. Like, what do you think about that?
I'm very upset about that. BC's growing laws are the most restrictive, other than Quebec and Manitoba, which are trying to ban home growing entirely, and that might not be constitutional, but the BC restrictions probably are constitutional, and they amount effectively to a ban on home growing for the vast majority of people in the province. And there's a 1-2 punch they put in. First of all, you have to have your all standing leases are now understood to include a ban on home growing. So if you want to grow cannabis at home, your landlord has to agree with written approval, even if you want to grow it in your backyard or on your patio or something. I can understand maybe a landlord needing to agree if you want to grow indoors with lights or something like that. But for a landlord to forbid you from growing cannabis in your backyard, that shouldn't be allowed. They shouldn't be able to do that. Secondly, as you mentioned, no one can see your plants. Plants have to be not visible from any public space. And if someone can see your plant, that's actually punishable by $5,000 fine and 3 months in jail. And if it happens a second time, those maximum penalties double to a $10,000 fine and 6 months in jail, which is absolutely absurd that there's a possibility of being put behind bars for growing a legal plant because someone else can see it. And the effect of this will be that there will be people in every town. There's only takes one person who hates cannabis, just one person who decides they're going to walk around town on their tippy toes looking for cannabis plants and calling the police. And as if the police, who don't want to deal with this anyways, as if the police want to come to your house and go, oh, your cannabis plant is visible from this one spot on the street, we've got to fine you or charge you now. It's just absurd. And I spoke to Mike Farnworth, who's the public safety minister, who's responsible for this legislation, and he said, well, it's not so hard just to put a screen up or block your plants in some way, but effectively it means that people who live in an apartment can't grow on their balcony. It means if you don't have a fence in your backyard and your own private property, you can't grow. And most people, it means only people who are wealthy and own their own homes with a big fence will effectively be able to grow cannabis. And the BC NDP, we're facing a massive health crisis right now with the overdose deaths. And in British Columbia, the BC NDP is promoting a campaign to eliminate the stigma around drug use and reminding us that drug users are parents and children and family members and hockey fans and whatnot. So they want to reduce the stigma around drug use, but at the same time, they're stigmatizing cannabis so much that if somebody sees your plant, you can go to jail for months. That is a terrible hypocrisy. And one that's really upsetting. So I'm very unhappy about that. And I've been toying with the idea of launching a campaign for people to put their 4 little tiny seedlings on their front lawn and then call the police on themselves. And I would love to do that. I'm still kind of putting it together, but I'm thinking October 18th, I might be sitting in my front yard with 4 little seedlings and call the VPD, who are not going to want to deal with that. The VPD are going to say, why are you turning yourself in for your 4 plants? But if we can do that across the province, perhaps we could make a point. And if you refuse to pay your fine and go to trial, if we could really push that. But it takes some people who are brave enough to risk some of these penalties to make a point.
So your concern about this part of the law, it's mostly because of the stigmatization element to it, or is it related to property rights at all, or individual rights, or is it mostly because of the continued stigmatization?
Well, the government is saying you can grow 4 plants, which is too restrictive, but definitely better than 0 and definitely a good start. And then for the province to say, well, okay, but we're going to put all these restrictions in to make it virtually impossible. And we're going to punish you very, very severely in ways that just don't make any sense. That really is continuing prohibition. And there's tons of penalties in this BC legislation which are absurd, especially when you compare them to alcohol. So if you own a houseboat in British Columbia, you can drink alcohol on your houseboat, no problem. You can't smoke cannabis on your houseboat. You can't even eat a cannabis capsule on a cruise ship. If you eat a cannabis capsule on a cruise ship, you and the captain both face that $5,000 fine and 3 months in jail. You can only drink alcohol on a boat where there's a kitchen and like a sleeping area, and when the boat is anchored. But you can't do that with cannabis. And if you get caught, for instance, drinking alcohol in a canoe where it's illegal, it's a fine for a few $100s. But if you get caught smoking a joint in a canoe, it's once again $5,000 fine, 3 months in jail. So even where maybe there should be a penalty or where it should be restricted in some way, the penalties involved are literally hundreds of times or dozens of times more strict than they are with alcohol. And it goes all across the board like that. So a parent, for instance, can share alcohol with their own child when that child is a minor, and that's not a crime. Plenty of families will give their minors wine with dinner or a small amount of alcohol, or perhaps a parent just wants to introduce their child to alcohol at age 16 or something, and drink with their kid instead of having it be in an uncontrolled area with their friends or whatever. And that's legal and even encouraged in some ways for parents to take that responsibility on and teach their kids about alcohol. But an adult parent who smokes cannabis with their child when that child is not an adult. So if you smoke a joint with your son or daughter before their 18th birthday, you face very severe penalties and potential jail time. And so these kind of things really are based. They base these laws in the idea that cannabis is much more harmful than alcohol, that cannabis is a very dangerous substance, and that the penalties involved for breaking any cannabis laws need to be very, very extreme compared to the same situation with alcohol, where there's no penalty, or the penalty is just a small fine or something like that. And I'm very disappointed in the BC NDP because I thought these guys were going to pass evidence-based laws and use human rights as a basis to start. But instead, they've used prohibition as a basis to start and are really subverting the goal of ending prohibition, which is to end stigma, end arrests, and treat cannabis users as regular human beings. And they've really failed when it comes to that.
And do you know where they came up with the idea of only allowing people to grow 4 plants? Like, it sounds like a pretty arbitrary number to me.
Yeah, that's federal legislation, right? So that's a federal law, and I think they probably they wanted to have some kind of a limit because, I mean, I don't think there should be any limits at all. But I can understand when you've got prohibition in other countries and where cannabis is very expensive, that if they let everybody grow 100 plants or 1,000 plants, then there'd be a lot of it being diverted to the U.S. or to other markets. So they want to put some kind of limit on it. And I don't really agree with that, but I understand that. And certainly I hope that it's easier to get from 4 plants to 40 plants than it was to get from 0 to 4. But it is very arbitrary. Why not 6 plants or a dozen plants? I think they kind of based that on some of the Colorado. I think Colorado, you're allowed to grow 4 or 6 plants or something. And I think they kind of just wanted to have a low number, but still something that qualified so that people could have enough to grow their own and get some for themselves. What I am glad about is that they had initially talked about having a limit of 100 centimeters on your plant, so it couldn't be more than a meter tall. And that limit was removed, so there's no size limitation on how big your plants can be, other than the provincial legislation that limits them being visible. So yeah, that I think the 4 plant limit is arbitrary and too low, but that's federal legislation, not provincial, so the BC government can't really impact on that.
Right. And I noticed that there's still the idea of illicit cannabis, and I'm wondering, could you explain a little bit what that's going to entail? Like, what exactly will illicit cannabis be under the law?
It is going to be very difficult to enforce the illicit cannabis provisions, and I don't really know why they're in there, certainly when it comes to possession. Mm-hmm. But because, yeah, you can't possess illicit cannabis, or once again, you face some fairly severe penalties. But illicit cannabis would be something that you bought outside the system. Now, you're allowed to share and trade cannabis freely. So if I grow cannabis in my house, I'm allowed to give it to you if I want. That's not against the law. So it'll be very hard to determine what illicit cannabis is and what it isn't. But for instance, if you walk into a dispensary and you buy cannabis and you walk out, a police officer could arrest you for possession of illicit cannabis, and that charge would stick. I mean, whether or not they want to go to trial or whatever, but that would be a valid charge under the way the law is written. If you buy cannabis from a dispensary or something like that, that is illicit cannabis. And provincially also, they've duplicated that law, so it's against the law federally to possess illicit cannabis, and it's also against the law provincially. And the provincial penalty is the same as the federal one, $5,000 fine, 3 months in jail. But federally, it doesn't change if you get caught twice. But under BC legislation, if you get caught with cannabis a second time, the penalty doubles to a $10,000 fine and 6 months in jail. And I asked the minister, why did you pass this provincial law? What that means is that even if the federal government decides at some point that the ban on illicit cannabis is not needed and they get rid of it, it would still be in place provincially. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, If you get convicted federally under for possession of illicit cannabis and you pay your fine, that's a criminal record, which means it's shared with the U.S. government, which means it's hard for you to cross the border, and it makes it hard for you to get a job. But if they convict you under the provincial legislation, then you don't get a criminal record, and so it's a little less penalizing. But so that's fair enough on one way. But on the other hand, they could have done the same thing, but made the penalty a $5 fine. They didn't have to have these same high federal penalties under that, and to have it double, so you actually get a worse sentence a second time in BC compared to the federal law. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so, to me, possession of illicit cannabis should not be a crime. Maybe selling it outside the system should be penalized in some way, right? But to possess it, it shouldn't be a crime. And really, in Canada, we should be decriminalizing possession of all drugs. Numerous health authorities have said the best way to fight the opioid crisis is with decriminalization and stop treating drug users as criminals. And so at a time when everyone who understands drug policy or public health is recommending decriminalization of all drugs, the BC government and the federal government are criminalizing illicit cannabis. It makes no sense at all.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that decriminalization of all drugs would be the right way to go, or is legalization of all drugs appropriate?
Well, I think decriminalization of all substances, so possession of any drug, should not be a crime. But yeah, there should be. I think legalization should be available. I'm not sure you should be able to buy every single drug at the corner store, for instance. But I do think that every drug should be available one way or the other. So I would, if I was in charge, I would regulate drugs more by potency than by substance. So coca leaves or coca tea should be widely available as coffee with no real age limit. But if you need injectable cocaine, that should maybe be under a doctor's supervision or some kind of heavily restricted access, because that's a lot riskier and can cause a lot of problems. But it shouldn't be a crime. It should just be more restricted in terms of access. Just with alcohol, where you can get beer and wine quite readily. Stronger spirits are available, but a little more restricted. And things like pure alcohol are very restricted and difficult to get, because very pure alcohol can be dangerous for your health. So it's still available, but it's just more restricted. So, same with opiates. I would legalize smokable opium and opium tea at certain potencies. But if you need injectable heroin or something, that should also be legally available. But it shouldn't be just in the corner store next to the smokable opium. It should be more restricted and more controlled. And I think that is a better model. And certainly the psychedelics and entheogens should also be widely available and more available and more accessible to people, but also with some rules and instructions on how to use them and make sure you're using it properly and in the best way to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms. So I'm for ending all prohibition on all drugs, but that doesn't necessarily mean they all are regulated in the same way. They should be regulated and controlled in different ways, depending on the substance and what its risks are and what its benefits are.
Do you think the age restrictions are fair in terms of the legalization in BC? Like, I understand that there's no purchasing, selling, or consuming cannabis under the age of 19. Does that sound fair to you?
Well, if I was in charge, I would make it a lower number. I would probably stick with 18 maybe, which is the same as the federal law. We made it a year higher. We sell caffeine products to children of any age. And caffeine is more addictive and more dangerous than cannabis is. But I really do think it's a family issue, right? When you're a minor, you're still sort of under the control of your parents, and there's family decisions to be made. So, I don't think it should be a crime for a minor to possess cannabis, but I also think that parents do have a role in deciding with their children what the appropriate age is and what access is. So, I don't think it should be a crime for a parent to share cannabis with a minor child. I think that should be allowed as long as it's in a reasonable way, just like with alcohol, right? It's got to be reasonable. But I think having an age limit to buy cannabis in a store is appropriate. I would probably make it 16, because that is the age which the Canadian Senate recommended that legalization start at. that people be able to buy when they put out their massive report on cannabis. And I think that if you could start using cannabis before you start using alcohol, that I think is appropriate, because cannabis is so much less harmful and less risky. And I think it makes more sense to allow people to use it at a younger age. Maybe there would be some restrictions, like only certain cannabis products or certain things, maybe really strong edibles or certain kinds of dabs or something would be more restricted by age. But generally, I do think there should be some kind of age limit involved, not so much because cannabis is super dangerous to minors, but because I think families and parents have a right to limit and control their children's actions to a certain extent. That's just part of being a parent, and I think that that's appropriate.
And what are your thoughts about the federal laws that are going to allow for punishing people who sell cannabis to those under 19 with up to like 14 years in prison? Because that sounds kind of insane to me.
Once again, they've got a situation where the cannabis laws and the alcohol laws are wildly divergent. And there probably should be some kind of a penalty if you're breaking the rules and selling cannabis to a minor. But for it to involve jail time and this kind of extreme penalties that are more appropriate for sexual assault or a violent crime, that makes no sense at all, right? If you sell alcohol to a minor, you can get a fine, you can lose your license to serve alcohol, things like that are more the focus. But nobody's been threatened with extensive jail time for selling cannabis to a minor, nor should they, or for selling alcohol to a minor, nor should they be. And so the cannabis penalties across the board, when compared with the same thing for alcohol, are just absurdly punitive. And it's very disappointing that they've decided to go that route and to put these penalties in place that are far beyond what are appropriate. In many cases, there should be no penalty at all. And when there should be a penalty, it should be on par with what alcohol would be under those same circumstances, and not dozens and dozens of times more severe.
Mm-hmm. And what are your thoughts about the impaired driving laws surrounding cannabis and the changes that are coming there?
Well, it's going to be a problem, and I think there's a lot of misinformation and fear-mongering around driving on cannabis. I mean, first of all, there's no evidence that more people are going to drive under the influence of cannabis than before. So any problem we have with cannabis and driving already exists and will probably get easier to deal with under legalization because people have other options. As a minor, we used to smoke in our car, because my friend's car, because there was nowhere else to go. We couldn't smoke at home. We couldn't smoke in a park. There was no lounge or place to go to. The only place we could feel safe was driving around in a car. And I think people often make that choice. So, of course, cannabis also is not particularly impairing of the skills required to drive. It does depend on the person and how you consume it. I would argue that eating a large quantity of cannabis can certainly be impairing and almost psychedelic sometimes, and that people should not be driving after eating cannabis, nor do they choose to. Because unlike alcohol, which increases your bravado and makes you think you can do things you can't do, cannabis often acts the opposite way and makes you more cautious and less willing to take risks and more likely to avoid situations like that. And when it comes to smoking cannabis, in the quantities most people use it, cannabis is simply not impairing, or far less impairing than legal amounts of alcohol are. So the paranoia around cannabis and driving is really, I think, more about police trying to find a way to preserve their jobs and get more work, and a way of those who are against cannabis of finding a way of demonizing it and creating fear in the public perception of cannabis. But in reality, cannabis for most users is not particularly impairing. If you're a novice user, if you are using a lot of cannabis, or if you're combining it with alcohol, then cannabis can be impairing. But the way to deal with cannabis impairment is not to try to find some kind of roadside blood test or saliva test which will determine how much cannabis is in your body, because that is not related to impairment. Somebody who's used cannabis days earlier or someone who's a very regular user of cannabis and is using it regularly for medical or other reasons, they will have cannabinoids in their bloodstream but are very unlikely to actually be impaired. And so we need to deal with cannabis potential impairment the way we deal with every other substance except for alcohol, because there are all kinds of pharmaceutical drugs that can be impairing, that can be very impairing. And we don't have blood tests for any of those substances. What they do is they put a warning on the label saying, don't operate heavy machinery, be aware. And if you're driving under the influence of Valium or some other potentially impairing pharmaceutical and you have an accident or you're swerving around or the officer thinks you're impaired, they'll give you an actual impairment test where you walk a straight line and count backwards and things like that. And I think that testing for impairment and testing for cannabinoid levels are two totally unrelated things. And so the legislation which bases everything on cannabinoid levels and on an absurdly low cannabinoid level in your bloodstream is going to make it very unfair for people. In British Columbia, they've put in a zero tolerance for any cannabinoids in your bloodstream if you're a new driver. And that lasts for quite a few years, your new driver status, right? But in effect, that means that if you walk by a crowd of people who are smoking cannabis, that will put enough cannabis in your bloodstream to make you unable to drive according to that legislation, even though you're absolutely not impaired at all. Someone who smoked cannabis on a Friday would still be prohibited from driving on a Monday, even though the cannabis has absolutely no effect on them in any way at that point. And so I think this, they have that for alcohol, the zero tolerance for alcohol for new drivers, but alcohol wears off very quickly. So if you drink alcohol on Friday, 6 hours later, it's out of your system and you won't fail a breath test. And that's good because you won't be impaired anymore. But with cannabis, it stays in your body for so long that it renders any test basically meaningless. And so I really think they should be focusing on actual impairment and impairment testing and not on bloodstream and saliva testing. And I expect there will be several court cases to challenge the federal laws. And what really happens will depend largely on what the courts say. And that is very hard to predict because the courts have generally given governments a lot of leeway when it comes to driving restrictions. So we'll see how that plays out. But I wish they'd focused more on impairment and less on what's in your bloodstream. And certainly, focusing on bloodstream means that somebody, like if you're under the influence of LSD, for instance, that won't show up on a blood test. But you shouldn't drive on LSD. That's a really bad idea. And so, but relying on a blood test will never solve that problem, right? So I think that is part of the issue, that they're trying to treat it like alcohol and focusing on blood tests when they should be trying to treat it like every other potentially impairing substance out there and rely on actual impairment testing. And I'll just add that there is actually the technology to do impairment testing very quickly and easily at the roadside. Not so much with the arbitrary test where you have to walk in a straight line and touch your nose, but there's actually machines that have a little video game that is specifically designed to test your impairment and reaction time. And I would love to see that kind of standardized impairment testing put in place, where it's not sort of up to some police officer to decide arbitrarily, whether you walked a straight line or not, but it's actually a science-based study or science-based test that really is very strict and very easy to quantify. And there's been a real resistance to them moving towards that, but that's what I would really love to see.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you there. So before we wrap it up, I was wondering if you could just tell me maybe what you think overall are the best parts of the law and the worst parts of the law, either federally or provincially. Like, what's your favorite or least favorite parts?
Well, provincially, I'm very unhappy with what they've done, but so I don't like the penalties for growing when someone can see your plants, the restrictions on home growing, the very severe penalties they put in place, how they're treating it far more strictly than alcohol. Those are all very bad. What I do like provincially is that they haven't tried to create a sales monopoly provincially. They're going to allow independent shops to operate, even though they'll still obviously be selling all the same products. I think it's good that at least they're opening it up to retail sales and broader sales, and not just only government shops. That's about the only good thing about the provincial legislation. Federally, I mean, I although there's a lot of flaws, I certainly support the legislation in general. And if it was a yes/no vote, I would have voted yes, although I'd much rather fix things in it. I don't like how it's treating cannabis so much more severely, how it's how it's restricted access, and how it's penalizing people so much. But what I do like is that we're going to see possession charges drop in Canada from around 50 or 60,000 people a year down to a very small number. There'll still be some possession charges and possession arrests for illicit cannabis and nonsense like that, and we'll need to fight those. But there's going to be tens of thousands of Canadians who would have faced harassment, arrest, and persecution for possession of cannabis, and that won't happen. And that is a huge step forward. And being able to buy cannabis in a shop is a huge step forward, even if it's restricted and there's only cannabis smokables and no edibles and it's all monopolized and blah, blah, blah. It's still incredible that we're doing that. And I think one of the most important things about legalization in Canada is the effect it will have on the international community, that other countries will go, look, Canada legalized marijuana. Why can't we too? And because Canada is a G20 country and a G8 country, because we're right next to the US, and because of our status in the world, I think that our legalization will be very influential. And people in other countries might not know all the details. They might not know all the specific reasons why we're unhappy and whatnot. They're just going to know Canada legalized it. Why can't we do that here too? And so I think this will really accelerate the trend that's already begun around the world of moving towards legalization, ending prohibition. The president of Mexico is talking about legalizing marijuana and opium in some way to deal with the problems they're having there, which I think is great. And part of their argument when in Mexico, he says, look, a whole bunch of American states have legalized. Canada's legalized. What the hell are we doing here in Mexico, fighting a drug war against our own people when the rest of the continent's made it legal? So I think that's probably the biggest impact. And I also think that just the fact that there's going to be legal makes it less stigma. There's a lot of people who simply want to obey the law, strangely enough. And so when cannabis is illegal, they just say, well, it's against the law, so it's wrong. It's morally wrong, it's against the law. Don't do it. And when it's legal, they'll say, well, it's legal now, so it's okay now. You can do that. And I think that that's going to help a lot, that people who were scared of admitting they were cannabis users or who just didn't want to come out of the closet or be open about it, there'll be less of that fear. And I think in the same way that that other minority groups sometimes fear punishment or fear or have to sort of hide the stigma of being who they are, I think this will help cannabis users a lot in coming out into the open, in being mainstream, and being able to acknowledge that they use cannabis and not have to be ashamed of that. I think it'll make a tremendous difference. And I really see this legalization, it's the beginning of a process. And it's a huge hurdle we've overcome once this law passes. But it's by no means the end of our efforts. As activists and advocates for cannabis, we still have a lot of work to do. People have asked me, well, are you going to cancel 420? Once cannabis is legal, you have nothing to protest about. And I've always said, no, we're going to do more events like 420, and it's going to be bigger. And we still do have lots to protest and lots to celebrate. And so I think that really, if we see these laws as we're all done and this is it, well, no, these are really bad laws. But if we see this as the beginning of a process, which will probably take another 20 years or more, then I think that makes more sense to sort of view it like that. When they ended alcohol prohibition in Canada, for 10 years after alcohol prohibition ended, the only sign a bar or a beer parlor could put outside on their building was one that said open. They couldn't promote they sold alcohol in any possible way. And it took 10 years before they were allowed to add a second sign, which said licensed establishment. And that was the only way they were able to promote the sale of beer and alcohol for like 20 years after Prohibition ended, until we have now where we've got brightly colored bottles and marketing, and things are much more open. And so I think it's going to take decades before we get to a point where cannabis can be promoted and where cannabis users can be destigmatized. You know, our current prime minister admitted that he used cannabis while he was an MP, but we've never had a politician say, I use cannabis today and I'm going to smoke some tomorrow too. No one will say that. And if you think about it, I mean, which would you think would be more likely to be a groundbreaker in Canada? You know, a prime minister of color, a prime minister who's part of the LGBT community, or a prime minister who says, I hit the bong every day? Probably that last category is less likely to be elected in Canada, even though none of those things should be a disqualification, and being a cannabis user or being part of a minority group or whatever, none of those things should disqualify you. But I can imagine more readily in Canada us breaking the barriers in terms of having a person of color or an LGBT prime minister than I can imagine having a prime minister who just uses cannabis instead of alcohol the way they drink alcohol. So I think that shows that, you know, our community is still stigmatized and still has a long way to go in achieving true social and legal equality in Canada.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks a lot for talking to me, dude. I really appreciate it. That was really informative.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.